So, hello guys, and welcome to video number 2 in this series. So, I'm International Master Alex Astaneh for Chessfactor, and hope you enjoyed part 1. If you haven't checked that out yet, then I would recommend you go see that first, as the flow of the series will make a lot more sense. Very quick recap. In the first video, we were talking mainly on active versus passive play with a focus on active play. In this video, I want to show an example of a game where it was actually taken from a game I played myself in a tournament against an international master from the US. And in this particular game, I felt that a more passive course of action was best. First of all, before I kind of get into the variation that I actually played, I want to talk about the possibility that I had chosen more active continuations and what those might have been in this position. So in this position here, I would consider active moves to be anything that tries to leverage this majority that we have. These 3 pawns here against only 2 gives us a potential for a passed pawn that could potentially decide the game in our favor. So that would be one option. And another active move might be something very, very active, might be something like queen to g5. Might also be something like h4, h5, although that seems quite silly. For me, the main move, number 1 active move would be the move pawn to d6, then number 2, c4, and number 3, maybe b5. Whereas when it comes to more passive moves, I would say a move, or more conservative, I would say a move that keeps the queen on our half of the board, maybe e3, maybe f2, maybe e2, maybe e1, something like that. But the aim of such a move is just to try and complete our development here with this bishop. So again, strictly speaking, active and passive would be incorrect terms, in the sense that we can classify a move like queen e1 or queen f2 as an active move in the senses where we want to activate. But I mean more so aggressive or hostile moves versus more conservative moves designed to, improve our position a little bit rather than try to break through like a move like d6. So hopefully that meaning is the intended meaning here is clear. So before we talk about any of these more passive moves like a queen move or like king h1, let's actually look at the possible sequences if we went for one of these aggressive pawn moves. So for example, the move b5 would make sense if white wants to, let's say black wastes time. White may want to push this pawn to b6 at some point, and if black captures, then we have created a passed pawn here. So this might make some sense, but let's actually look at how the game might continue with b5. Black could try an active possibility, e4 here, activating his bishop, and then white would continue with b6, and now comes the move e3. Now, as you can see, white cannot put his queen on e2 because, which might be the desirable square, because the pawn on c3 would fold, so queen e1. And now comes the move e2. And again, white cannot put his rook on d4 because we would capture it. He cannot put his rook on d3 because, again, black would capture it. So we might expect that white would go rook d2. Now, after rook d2, the problem is bishop takes c3 ends the game in black's favor, because this rook has no good move and it's about to be captured. Rook b1 would lose the rook anyway, and we cannot move our bishop. We don't have any good squares. If we take here, we would lose the bishop and still have problems with the rook and being pinned. So the position is just hopeless here, where we've just gotten absolutely crushed. And to add insult to injury, black has this strong 7th rank pawn that we cannot take because of the pin on our queen. So that would be a total disaster to go down this b5 path. But let's see what would happen in the event of c4. Now, after c4 would come maybe the same move, e4. And in this case, we can go rook to b1 because the diagonal of the bishop has been blocked. However, the problem is e3 will give us the same similar problem as the last time. Once we move our queen, we will lose this rook. So this is also a resignable position. Finally, let's look at the move d6. Again, let's assume that black reacts quite actively to our aggression and he takes here on d6, and so we follow up with queen takes pawn. Black himself takes on c3, hitting this rook. And now we don't really have much time for anything too ambitious like bishop takes pawn, because we would lose this rook, so we better give a check here. Bishop on d5, king h8, and now attend to this rook. Let's find the most aggressive move, bishop g5. So far, both sides, since the first move of pawn to d6, both sides have been playing more or less the best moves at each turn. Now black goes e4. We take here. Rook moves. We played the rook here to c1. Again, notice we've been giving checks. We've been countering threats with threats of our own. We've been developing our pieces to some of the most aggressive squares we can think of. And yet, the outcome after the moves queen b2, best move from white, bishop c6, and rook f8, is that according to modern day computers, and they're much stronger than any humans on the planet, this position is objectively lost. So what was the actual mistake? Well, the mistake was the move pawn to d6. Now, we have actually proven that the moves pawn to d6 here, pawn to c4, and pawn to b5, that they're all very, very bad ideas. But I'll let you guys into a little secret, which is probably not so much of a secret right now, and that is that actually I didn't analyze any of these sequences in my game. So I took a different approach in terms of trying to figure out what the best path was here. And it's a much more intuitive approach based on the fundamentals of the position itself. So what do I mean by this? Well, in this position, when trying to judge whether active moves like aggressive options like d6 or c4 or b5 would make sense and would be likely to work out for me, I looked at king safety. So initially I thought, well, white's king is exposed here, but black's king is potentially exposed along this diagonal. But upon closer inspection, we can say that white's king is probably a little more vulnerable than black's overall. And the reason why I say this is because at the very least, this diagonal right now leads to an immediate check, whereas white still has to lift this obstacle before he can give a check. Also, if we were to check him on this diagonal, having removed this, then very often he might have the resource bishop to e6. Whereas right now, we do not have the equivalent resource. So I would say that our king safety is weaker than his. Additionally, our light squares are structurally a bit weak because the pawns are on dark squares for us, which means the dark square pawns only cover dark squares, and therefore we're quite reliant on this bishop on g2 to cover our light squares. A subtle detail, but if you notice, bishop h3 can immediately offer a trade of these bishops, whereas white cannot do the same to black. We do not have the equivalent move because our queen stands in front of the bishop. So overall, I would say that the king's safety at first sight seems similar, but actually subtle details means that black's king is relatively safer, in my opinion. The second thing would be the general configuration of our pieces. If we notice, black has actually developed both of his bishops, whereas for us, we still have our c1 bishop undeveloped. So his minor pieces are better than ours. Another thing about the black position is every piece is defended at least once. And there's quite a good harmony, quite good coordination between the pieces. That's not the case for us here as the white side. The rook on a1 is undefended and it's being x-rayed. So that's potentially very, very dangerous for us. The bishop on c1, not only is it undeveloped, but it currently cannot move because the a3 pawn is defended. And the rook on d1, while it's not bad, it's probably our best piece, it doesn't mean that overall our rooks are better than his rooks, because overall, this rook here is such a big problem for us that the fact that this rook might be a little bit better than his e-rook is not enough. It's not enough to make up for the problems of this rook on a1. So overall, we have worse king safety, and we have worse piece configuration. So the way in which I determined, let's forget about d6, c4, or b5, is I understood through, years of experience and analysis of different positions and all of this, I understood that when you have fundamentals like these that are much worse than the fundamentals of your opponent, don't play, with fire, because you're going to get burned. And playing with fire in this case would be initiating an all-out assault, an active moves that try to open lines of attack, because more than likely you're going to end up with the worst of it against accurate play. So that's where we can see this, and we can prove this with a line like d6, takes, all of this that I showed earlier on. But we don't have to actually prove it. We can work by intuition and kind of assume it. It's a little bit like if you're thinking about picking a fight with somebody twice your size. It's very hard to figure out and to give an answer to exactly how you might lose that fight. What's going to be the exact sequence? But it's probably not that difficult to, assume, to intuit that you're probably going to lose the fight, and it's probably a bad idea to initiate it, right? So that's kind of the point here in terms of active versus passive play. And so in this position here, I actually chose the move queen to e3. And after the move e4 from black, which was expected, it's an active move. Now, in his sense, for black, it makes sense to go for an active move for the exact opposite reasons that we rejected, right? In other words, we did not want to initiate active, or we did not want to launch active operations with a move like d6, because we understood we're in a bad position to open up lines of attack. But because he has better coordination, then it makes a lot of sense for him to go for it with e4. And here, as white, I put the queen on c5. And so my idea was that in this way, I would have my queen in a good square without obstructing this bishop. And so my plan was to develop the bishop, perhaps to f4, perhaps to g5 in the future, and complete my development, perhaps bring the rook to c1, improve my piece coordination, and just hope that I'm given enough time by my opponent to actually do this. Now, I actually went wrong, because when I then analyzed this game with a computer at home, the computer pointed out to me that it was probably slightly more precise to go to f2. The reason being that against e4 here, white might be interested in some line like bishop e3, giving this pawn on c3, and rook to c1, where you can even potentially trick the opponent if he starts to take this pawn. Now white has tricks like pawn to d6, and the position becomes very, very unclear. Black is up 2 pawns, but an important phenomenon has occurred, which is that very often in chess, when you spend time grabbing material, you lose coordination, and your opponent in turn gains coordination. And it's not a surprising phenomenon, because here we can see, while black has been busy picking up material, we've been busy playing, constructive moves. The first one, where we signal our intention to give up a pawn, we cover the placement, the protection, we protect the king here, and we make the we allow the bishop to get into the game. The second move, we block his pawn, thus reducing the activity of his light square bishop. And we give up this pawn, but in doing so, we not only develop our final undeveloped piece, but we also place it on a semi-open file, which favors us. And after bishop takes, only now do we play our first really aggressive move, which is this move pawn to d6, where we're now launching active operations against the opponent. But things have changed versus the starting position, as I hope you guys will agree. On top of this, we notice that this bishop is now undefended. So not only is it on a worse square than when it was on this long diagonal, but it's also vulnerable to, for example, some queen c2 and queen b3 or queen c4 checks. So that hopefully helps you to consolidate these ideas of active versus passive a little bit better, this particular variation. Now, in the game itself, I went queen e3, and against e4, I went queen c5, as I've said, and this was, of course, also one of the reasonable paths in the position. But the big important takeaway is that I didn't actually calculate any of these variations like d6 or c4 or b5. I simply understood that I'm lagging so far behind in important factors like king safety or piece configuration that all-out open warfare is probably going to end very badly for me. And that is the key behind intuitive decision-making processes, as we've discussed in video 1 and as will be discussed in this video series. If you want the focus to be more on, let's say, sequential play, like these variations of d6, takes, and how to get those processes right, then we have another series on calculation, which will tackle those topics in more depth. And of course, they're not exclusive; they're designed to be complementary series. So feel free to check them both out. That's it in terms of the example. But let's actually give you guys a couple of homework exercises, and well, good luck figuring these out. Let me just put them up on the board now. Okay, so here is position number 1, and I'd like you guys to think about whether you would go for active continuations, things that sort of take the game to your opponent, or whether you would look for something a little bit more conservative. So some active possibilities that I will mention are moves like bishop g5, bishop f4, just trying to maximize the potential of this bishop, knight to b6, hitting this rook, or finally also bishop to e3 with the intention of posting one of the minor pieces here on the c5 square, and from there create threats. If you put the bishop on c5, create a threat on this bishop, and if you put the knight on c5, you can create threats on a6 and e6. So those are some of the more active possibilities. More passive possibilities are moves like, or conservative, are moves like h3, creating luft for the king, b3, solidifying this knight and preparing to slowly bring out the bishop, bishop d2, covering against potential bishop b4 attacks, or even perhaps a move like rook to d1 here, just protecting against these attacks in a different way. So let me know what you guys think. Would you in general feel like it's an active move that is required, or like it's a passive move that is required? And you guys, as previously, you can write your thoughts in this video, and I will in a separate video quickly run you guys down the reasoning behind the move, tell you the moves that are best and the reasoning behind them. Okay, so that is example number 1. Example number 2 now. Okay, here is the second example. It's taken from one of my games, one of my relatively recent games played this year. And in this position here, the question is, of course, black has to respond to this major threat, but he has more passive ways, more, let's say, conservative ways to respond to it. One is bishop to e7 here, just blocking against the threat. Another one is knight to e7. Another one, and those are the sort of the two, let's say, most conservative. After that comes the move f6, blocking the threat like this. But then there are different queen moves. So there's queen e8, queen f8, Those are the more conservative ones, while the more aggressive, more active would be queen b6 or queen a5. And somewhere in between is this move queen c7, because it's quite active, but it's also got some conservative defensive elements. It's a bit of a hybrid move. So the question is, number one, would you think this position you should play active or you should play passive? Just taking into account the overall factors, the fundamentals of the position. And secondly, what is the move that you would actually go for? So I'll talk about these two positions now in the next video, where we are solving the homework. But of course, this is not like school. If you don't want to do this, you guys can skip these videos, but some people wanted a little bit more interactivity. So we listened, and hopefully you guys enjoy this idea. That's been it from me. Hope to see you in the very next homework video. And yeah, if you liked the video, please give it a like. As always, if you like this type of content, you want to be notified of more, then please subscribe. And yeah, other than that, I'll see you guys next time.